Oh, yeah.
I have prayed a lot about exactly what I was gonna share. I mean, it's my testimony, it's just my story, but I would think about parts of it and I would think, ugh, I don't think they really need to hear that part, that's not gonna help anybody, or I think about something else and I think, well, it's been good. I've been here a few months, but this is gonna change everybody's opinion of me when they find out. But then I remembered that my phrase for the year, how people have a word for the year or whatever. I have a phrase for the year, and it's really inspiring if you need to write this down or something. It's get over yourself. So I remembered that it is not important what people think about me. It is what my life or my testimony makes them think about God.
That's right.
How you see me doesn't matter, but how I make you see God does matter. So, and then also, one day I was driving to Skinham, where I live, and I was praying about it, about what parts to share and stuff, and I got home and I had a message on Facebook, and I didn't recognize the name at first, and it wasn't one of my Facebook friends, and in the message she told me her maiden name, and she said, I was just wondering if we could talk sometime. Could you call me and let's talk? She said, I wish I could tell you why, but I don't know. God has just been whispering your name to me, and I feel like we need to talk. And she said, maybe I need to tell you how much your testimony meant to me as a teenager and how He's used it in my adult life to bring about a transformation, and now she's, walking with Christ. And I was like, okay, God, I'll tell him everything. I grew up in Mississippi in a small country church. My dad was and is, he's 90, he's a deacon. He's been the mayor of this little town for 30-something years, and he told me back before Christmas that he wasn't running this year, and I said, why not? He said, I'm 90, I've got things to do. He said, I can't run this town for the rest of my life. My mother played the piano and the organ, and we were there for everything, including mowing the lawn and cleaning the church. We were there for everything. So I can't blame my decisions for the path that I took on the way I was raised, because they did absolutely the best that they could. When I was about 8, we had a visiting, we had the revival services that were every night of the week. Y'all remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, mercy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it got long about Wednesday.
Oh,
We
yeah.
still had homework and stuff. But this guy had us all the kids come up front, and he did a children's sermon and had an object lesson that was, it was really good. And then he asked who I wanted to ask Jesus into their heart, and all my friends raised their hands, so I did too. And afterwards, I don't remember anybody explaining anything to me or praying with me or anything. Just a couple of weeks, we all got baptized together, and that was fun. But it was enough to confuse me, because for many years I thought that I was a Christian. As a child, I loved attention, and I figured out that I could get people's attention by making them laugh. So I did impressions. I'm not gonna, don't worry.
Go ahead.
I do impressions, because a lot of you wouldn't even remember these people, but when I was really little, I did Paul Lynn. Anybody remember Paul Lynn? And my parents would have me do it for all their friends and stuff, and then I got older and I did Gilda Radner, and so my brother and sister would have me do that for all their friends. But when I got in elementary school, I was the funny one and not the pretty one. I was taller than all the boys, and I wore glasses like Harry Potter, round glasses, and I had frizzy hair that it might do this, it might do that, it might just whatever it wanted to do for the day, that's what it did. I felt like I looked like a troll doll. And all my friends had boyfriends, and I wanted one. And I'm like talking, that's 2nd grade. And my mother always said that I was boy crazy. But in the summer going into the 9th grade, I kind of had a little bit of a transformation. I lost some weight and my hair worked through its issues. And I started to get attention from boys. And I loved that. And it didn't take me long to figure out what I had to do to keep their attention, unfortunately. And that's when I really started to go wild. And I got a reputation for drinking, for smoking pot, for driving fast, and for fighting, and that's a whole different story that we won't get into today, but there were cops involved several times. So my senior year, I got suspended for 7 days because we took alcohol to the prom. Like, we snuck in suitcases of alcohol and had them in a back room, and people would bring their punch cup and sit it down in front of us, and we would take it back and bring back a mixed drink. And the principal said that we were responsible for getting kids drunk who had never had a drink in their life. And I said, well, we didn't force anybody to do anything, and you need better adult chaperones. And he didn't really appreciate my response on that. And he suspended me for 7 days, and he grounded his daughter from me for a year. And we were best friends from the time we were babies, so that was very hard for us. And she was that one friend that I stayed close to, but she never drank with me. We went out, we did our thing, she came to my house, I went to her house. But when I was going out with, the friends who did and stuff, she never did. She was amazing. And Marla and I stayed really close until she passed away in 2013. And I have apologized to her dad so many times for the difficult situations that I put him in. And of course, he forgave me, and I still stay in touch with them and visit them when I'm in town. I went to college at the University of North Alabama, which is in Florence, where we just moved from. And when I got to college, it got even worse. I had complete freedom. I didn't have a curfew. The dorm was closed at 4, but it didn't matter. You could stay wherever you wanted to. And there were a lot of nights that I stayed out all night. I think even as a child, I started to lie. And I lied more and I lied more until it was the easy thing to do. I don't think I even knew I was lying sometimes. It just came out of my mouth. And especially in college, I lied to my parents a lot. We didn't have cell phones back then. And people now think, oh, that must be awful to not have a cell phone. No. It was good. For me in my life, because no one knew exactly where you were. They didn't have GPS or Find My Phone or whatever. You either had to talk to something on the wall, or you had to go in these boxes that were called phone booths. It was crazy. They were like one every 3 blocks. So I would just tell my parents I was somewhere else. I would call, my roommate would call me and say, your mom just called the dorm, and I'd say, it's okay, and I'd call her and say, I was in the shower, and I also lied to the guys that I dated. I never dated just one that seemed boring to me. It was always more than one, and sometimes it was brothers at the same time, best friends, whatever. And there would be a public one and then a private one that nobody knew about. And I had guys I dated at college, and then back in Mississippi when I went home on the weekends, there were other guys there that I dated. And I pledged to a sorority. And a lot of people have positive experiences with fraternities and sororities. I don't condemn that, I don't judge that, But for me, it was just more opportunities to party. You know, it was not good for me at all. There were many times in high school and college that I think God tried to get my attention in a lot of different ways, and I just pushed him away. You know, there might be, we might have one of those long revival services, and I would feel guilty about things and rededicate my life. I didn't realize that I didn't have a life to rededicate yet. And, you know, and I'd try to be good for a week or two, and it, you know, never lasted. And so when I was at UNA, I think God had to take everything away from me to get me to the end of myself and to get me to the place where I would look up to him. I had several things happen within just a few weeks that changed everything. My life was all about being the center of attention, about going to parties, about, you know, the guys that I dated, my friends in the sorority. My social life was my life, and that's all that mattered to me. The beginning of the end started with me finding out that I was pregnant. And I did not see that as a life inside of me. I saw it as bad luck, an inconvenience, and an obstacle that I needed to overcome. And so 2 friends drove me to Birmingham, and I had an abortion. And it was awful, and there were some kind of complications that resulted in me losing blood for several months afterwards, got severely anemic. I was so tired, it was just hard to function. Later, after I became a Christian, all of that came back, and I had to work through that. I realized that what I thought was bad luck was a precious life that God had created. And for many years, I felt guilty about that, and I felt like it was a girl, and that she never got to experience life because of me. She never got to do all these things. And one day God said, "Oh, yes, she did." Because of God's amazing grace, there is, you know, I don't know how things work in heaven, but in my mind, I can see her grow, you know. And there is now a 38-year-old woman that is living an amazing life. No, she never got to ride a bike or have a birthday party or see a sunrise, but she also hasn't been bullied. She hasn't had her heart broken, and she hasn't dealt with mental illness. She hasn't even heard of cancer or mass shootings or child abuse. She's never struggled with sin. She lives where there is no sin, no strife, and no heartache. She hasn't seen a sunrise, but she sees the sun every day. I picture her with my 27-year-old daughter that I lost. They've grown up together, and Jesus has told them about me, and they can't wait to meet me. A couple of weeks after the abortion, my sorority called everyone to be at a secret sister circle. It's just as evil as it sounds. We all sat on the floor in the dark in a big circle, and they passed a candle around. And you could only talk when you were holding the candle. And they said that we were there to address the behavior of one of the sisters. And they said that this girl partied too much, she had a drug problem, and she slept with a whole baseball team. And I was like, whoa, oh man, she's something. And so everybody who would get the candle, who had heard the story or had heard something about it, would tell what they had heard, and you know, they would what the purpose of the meeting was to get her to admit what she had done and be really sorry for it, and then, you know, deal with the consequences and go on. And so we were there for hours, and it was just getting more and more hateful. And the candle would come to me, and I would just pass it on because I hadn't heard these stories. And so we were there for several hours and nothing happened and the meeting ended, and it turned out that the adult sponsors, there was some kind of advisory council, had been in a back room the entire night, and they called me back there to see them, and I can still see and hear the lady saying, "Missy, did you not know they were talking about you?" And that just blew me away. Like all of my friends for hours had said awful, hateful things about me, and I didn't even know it was me they were talking about. You know, it was so humiliating. And some of the things that really bothered me about that is they talked about this girl. They talked about me like, you know, this was something awful that people don't do. But when I would come from Mississippi back to school in Alabama, when I went through Tishomingo County, I would stop and buy pot because they grew the best, and then I would sell it to whoever wanted it on campus. And one time when we were coming through there, when my kids were in high school, I told them that story. And David said, "Well, Mom, that was a felony." And I said, "No, it wasn't." And he said, "Yeah, you bought drugs and you went across the state line and you sold them." I said, No. I said, "I just sold them for what I paid for them. I didn't make a profit." So I said, "That's not a felony." And turns out it was. So, but a lot of those girls had bought pot from me, and they had partied right alongside me, you know, and then they had talked about me that way. So I lost it. I yelled and I called people names and used lots of very descriptive words, and took my sorority pin off and threw it, and I quit. And what had started this story was that what had happened was I'd gone out with a baseball player, and we went to a bar, and a lot of his friends were there drinking, and we joined them. And then a couple of girls come in, and they see me laughing and drinking in the middle of 15 guys. And every time the story was told, it got worse and worse. Mm-hmm. So I left the sorority house and got in my car. I was just driving around, and you know, looking back, it wasn't the end of the world, but try to be understanding of young people when things happen and they really feel like it's the end of the world. Because when you're in the middle of those things, I couldn't see any way that things could get better or any scenario where things worked out for me. So I got a case of beer, and I drove to this bridge that we used to go to party sometimes. There wasn't anybody there, and I sat down on the side of the bridge and got drunk with the intention of killing myself. And I don't know what happened. I just woke up the next morning in my dorm room with all my clothes on. I had to go looking for where my car was parked. I believe that God supernaturally spared my life and got me back to the dorm safely. A few days later, I took exams and I left UNA, and I never went back. I was at a place where God had stripped me of everything that I thought I needed. I still thought I'd been saved as a child, and I didn't want to live. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I just can't do it. You know, things have got to be different. So I took steps that I thought would help me to live the way I was supposed to. I ended friendships. I stopped going out at all, you know, to hang out with my girlfriends or going out on dates with guys or anything. But I was miserable because my heart and my mind still wanted to do those things. The only thing that had changed was that I was just toughing it out, you know, and not doing that. And then one Saturday, I went to a wedding. It was actually February 8th, 1986. And I went to a county school, and I had friends who went to county school, but they went to church in town. So the couple that were getting married, they went to county school, went to church in town, and Doug went to this church in town. He was the city boy. And so one of my friends was there during the reception, and I saw him, and I had already, I mean, you might call it stalking, but like, I had already gone to baseball games to watch him play and stuff like that. So I told her, I said, I would, thinking she would introduce me, I said, I would really like to go out with Doug. And she rolled her eyes and she said, who wouldn't? And she said that he's really picky who he goes out with, and he would never go out with you. So of course I was kind of like, we will see about that. So somebody introduced us, and we got started talking, and I knew he knew me. Everybody knew me. And so I told him, and I was honest about it, that I was trying to get my life straightened out. And he told me about a Bible study that they did on Tuesday nights. That was a Saturday. And he invited me to go, and the snow was forecasted for the weekend. So he said, if you'll give me your number, I can call you and let you know if the Bible study is canceled. And I said, okay. And it snowed all weekend, and Monday he called me, and we talked for 5 hours on the phone. And from then on, we spent as much time together as we could. Doug thought I was a Christian. If he had known I wasn't, he would have never gone out with me in the first place. So that first year of dating was tumultuous, to say the least. You had me, and I was a party girl who was trying really hard to be good, but I was failing at it. And then Captain America, who did everything perfectly and surrendered to preach 2 weeks after we started dating. So it was explosive. That first year we were held together with spit and duct tape and the Spirit of God. That's the only way. I mean, I know now that God wanted us together, but I don't know, it must have been funny sometimes for him and the angels to watch how we try to get through that. So we were going to the same junior college that spring semester, and then that fall I followed to a Baptist Christian college. Oh my goodness. It was so much harder to be good there. They had so many rules, and I wasn't good at rules at all. And like in the dorms, if you did something wrong, you got a rep, and if you got 10 reps, then you were campus, which meant you could only leave your room to go eat and go to class. And the first 6 weeks, I had 9, and I had to like go in front of the committee and explain myself and stuff. And it seemed like everybody there had it all together. It seemed easy for them to be a Christian. And in January, it was almost a year that we had been dating, Doug and I went to a revival service, and the evangelist who was speaking said that he had been a pastor for 20 years when he realized he didn't have a real relationship with Christ. And it suddenly all made sense. That was why I couldn't be like Doug and all these other people at the college, and I just held on to the pew and didn't go forward. And we left and headed back to the dorm, and I was driving. I didn't even know Doug was in the car, and I was crying so hard I had to pull over, and I parked on this little gravel road called Palestine Road, which I thought was very appropriate. And I just cried out to God. I didn't pray the sinner's prayer, I just talked to him. And I said, God, you know how awful I am. You know how awful I've been and the things that I've done. If I was you, I would not forgive me. it would not be in your best interest. But if you will, I give you everything. I give you the rest of my life. And he did. He forgave me. I went home, I went back to the dorm that night, and I called my mom about 12 o'clock that night, and I told her that I had been saved, and I said, I'm sorry for calling you so late, and she said that so many nights she had stayed up all night just praying that I would come home safely. And she said, so tonight I feel like I'll stay up all night just thanking him that he saved you. I didn't suddenly become perfect, but the change was very real. And I think it was apparent to Doug and my friends and my family and stuff. My desires changed. I didn't want to smoke and drink anymore, which I had secretly been doing to try to deal with the stress of fitting in. And the things that had been so hard, like reading my Bible and going to chapel, like that, we would go to chapel 3 times a week and somebody would preach, and that was just awful for me when I first went there, but those things made sense and I wanted more. A little side story here. When our kids were 9, 6, and 4 months old, we moved from Mississippi to Alabama, back to the area where I'd gone to college. And I wanted to see that bridge again that I'd sat on. And so from time to time, I would go looking for it, and all I could remember was that it was green steel, and it was in North Florence, and I remembered what it looked like driving up to it, but I never could find it. So years later, the summer before Hannah's senior year, she said she wanted to have some pictures made at Ghost Bridge, which was this bridge out in the middle of the woods that kids would go to sometimes. Whenever mine went, I made them knock on the door of the closest house and tell the people who they were and why they were walking in the woods and stuff. And they're like, you ruin the stuff for us. You say we can do it, then you ruin it. But I said, okay, we'll do that. So the photographer and Hannah and I go traipsing off through the woods, and when we stepped out onto that bridge, I realized that was it. That was the bridge. And I didn't say anything to Hannah, but she went over and the photographer got this picture of her sitting in the spot where I sat that night. And after this, I told her about it, and she said, well, you showed Satan. He brought you here to kill you, and you came back 24 years later and brought your daughter. And then she went back a few weeks after that and took this next picture for me of the bridge. And I love the way the light is shining down on it. And then she went back one more time before they tore it down, and she etched our initials in the steel. And she took this selfie and she put it on Instagram, and it says, standing where you stood one last time. I love you, you're the best mom ever. And then they tore it down and it's gone. Doug and I got married on December 17th, 1988. A year later we had David. 2.5 years later we had Hannah, and then 6 years later we had Ty. And when Ty was about 4 months old, it was right at the time we moved from Mississippi to Alabama. The way God worked all those things out, the timing of that. I had been homeschooling them because the school system we were in was just going through a really awful, they changed all their curriculum. It was just really bad. And I also lived in an area that when I got sick, it probably would have taken years to diagnose me, but he moved us to Muscle Shoals, which had one of the best school systems in the state of Alabama, and it's close to doctors and stuff. But I started to have weird symptoms. I couldn't feel my legs. I had an awful headache that went on for months. My primary care doctor was trying everything he could do to stop that. And then I started having episodes 3 or 4 times a day when my hands, my arms, my legs, my feet would contract. They didn't spasm, they just got really tight, and like my hands would draw up. And I couldn't do anything about it. Doug or my mom or whoever was with me would try to, massage it and help it, but it wouldn't help. And sometimes it was 15 minutes and it was terribly painful. And that actually happened in the neurologist's office the first time that I saw him. So he felt pretty sure what it was, but he sent me for a spinal tap and MRI. And then he called a few days later and said that I had multiple sclerosis. Living with MS has been difficult, but God has used it in so many ways. For about 17 years, I traveled all over the United States and spoke to groups of people who have MS and their caregivers. And I would always pray before every trip and ask God to use me, and then I would look for opportunities. And the way he put the timing together and worked all the things out so many times over the years, it just would blow my mind every time, something like this would happen. One time I was sitting in the waiting area to get on a plane, and I saw 4 boys walk up in Marine uniforms, and they looked so young to me. And so I just silently prayed for each one of them and their families. And then I got on the plane, and they came down the aisle, and one of them stopped beside my seat, and he said, "This is me," and he sat down, and we started, kind of small talk. And I asked where he was going. He said he was about to be deployed, and he didn't know where. And he talked about being a Christian, so I thought, I wonder why God put me by him, because he doesn't need me. And then he said, "Where are you headed?" I said, "I'm headed to Tucson, Arizona on work." He said, "What do you do?" I said, "I speak to groups of people who have MS." And he got big tears in his eyes. And he said, "My mama has MS. And I've been so worried about leaving her because I'm one of her caretakers." And I said, "Well, God set you beside me because he wants you to know that she's going to be fine, that you don't have to worry about it. He's going to take care of her." And when we got off the plane, he said that he felt so much lighter having that. He said, "I was going to go wherever it was I'm going with that burden, and I was going to carry it every day." And then another time I was seated in an aisle seat on a row of 3 seats. If you've ever flown, you know that if you're alone, the last place you want to be is in that middle seat. And I had the aisle seat. So I was watching people come on, and it was going to be a long flight, wondering who was going to be sitting in between me and the robust man in the window seat. And one of the last people to get on the plane was a Hawaiian man. And the first time I saw Moana and I saw Maui, I was like, "That's him." He had the long, wavy hair. He was probably 6'4", 6'5", and maybe 400 pounds of muscles. He was a mountain. And he stopped beside me, and he just went, kind of shrugged his shoulders, and I said, "Do you want me to switch places with you?" And he said, "Are you serious?" I said, "Yeah, no biggie." I knew it was going to be a biggie. I wasn't sure I could breathe sitting between these 2 guys this whole flight, but that was in the Lord's hands. So I moved over, and he put his stuff up, and he sat down, and he looked down at me, and he said, "Are you an angel?" And I said, "No. He said, "No, never been called one." I said, "But God did tell me to do that." And that started a conversation that lasted the entire trip. And he was in his mid-30s, and his wife had been killed in a car wreck the year before. And he was raising 3 children by himself. And they had been in church until she died, and he hadn't been back since then. And I don't remember what all was said, but by the time we landed, I had like an awful crick in my neck because I had sat and looked up and talked to him the whole time. And he had tears running down his cheeks, and the last thing he said, well, I guess I've got to go buy my kids some clothes because we're going to church tomorrow. So, that's the only ones I'm going to share, but I have story after story of things that God did. And I just wanted to take a couple minutes here to explain how MS affects me now. Maybe it'll help you know better how to pray for me, and maybe it'll help you understand when I'm not here or when I'm doing weird things or something. One of the things that I struggle with is fatigue, and that doesn't just mean I'm tired. The fatigue affects everything. One of the attacks that I had years ago was called drop foot, and that means that when you pick your foot up, your heel comes up, but your toes don't. So I trip, and it on flat ground. It doesn't have to be, and that's one of the signs my family has always known that, okay, I've hit it and I'm starting to go down. And so if we were in a mall or wherever and I tripped, one of my kids would come up and get my arm, not because they were sweet. They just didn't want me to embarrass them. Just smacking the floor in front of everybody. But about, I guess 6 weeks ago, my mom had a bad fall. And the weekend after, my dad and my sister were both wanting to go out of town, and they said, can you come take care of your mom? I said, yeah, that's fine. So the day I was going to do that, I left Fayetteville early that morning and went to our house in Florence. And Doug and Brother Chad and Ty moved all of Ty's stuff over to David's house. So our two sons, youngest and oldest, are living together right now. So put that on the prayer list. Because it's great, and then some days, it's not. But, so they left, and I did that final clean of a house, all 3 stories. There was no furniture, so I didn't sit down all day. And I left about 2 and went and got my kids and took them out to eat, and then drove to Mississippi. And so I was trying to act perky, like I wasn't tired in front of my mom. And I fell in the same spot that she had fallen, except she fell backwards and really hurt herself, and I just went on my face. And I just laid on the floor, and we laughed and laughed and laughed. And she would say, oh, don't make me laugh, you're making my ribs hurt. But sometimes when my foot's dragging, I fall, and you'll probably see me with bruises all over my arms where I catch myself on a door facing or on furniture or something to keep from falling. And so if I'm here with a cane, or if you see me walking and holding on to the wall, don't worry about me. I'm just trying to navigate my day. It doesn't mean that I'm in bad shape or my MS is worse or whatever. I'm just doing the day. The fatigue affects me cognitively. It affects my memory. I know how important names are, and I work really hard on names. But when I'm tired, sometimes my mind just goes blank. And you can ask my kids. They've been called every name in the book. And I might know you well. You know I know your name. I know your name. But at that moment, there's nothing. So please don't take that personally if I don't call you by name or if I forget or whatever. And the cognitive part, it also affects me finding the right words in a simple conversation. Words that I use every day and then they're not there. Or I say the wrong word, and it's a word that doesn't make any sense in the sentence. Like, instead of, we went through a little spell where I called paper clips zip codes, and so it doesn't make sense to anybody. My kids have learned to, I let them laugh, because otherwise it would have been very awkward and uncomfortable for them growing up. And when I'm talking to Doug and I can't think of words, I just say words. And sometimes he says, got it, I know what you're trying to say. And then other times he says, I have no earthly idea what you're trying to say. He said, I don't even know what we're talking about. I don't even know where to start on this one. It affects my voice. So the longer I talk, or by the end of the day, my voice gets weaker and weaker. I've had a lot of leg pain just because I have been doing so much more than my body's used to doing. And my neurologist and I are working on that. He's got me on some medication, but he also kind of talked me down. He said, you can't just do medication. He said, you've got to find a balance in your daily life, and you've got to stop overdoing it. He said, it is not going to hurt if everything is not unpacked and put where it's supposed to be. Or, he said, you've got to stop that, and you've got to plan better. And so I try, I'm going home, I'm going to bed for the rest of the day, so I'll be here tomorrow, but I try not to do big things on Saturdays because it will affect me Sunday. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm trying to not do much or save all my sit-down jobs to do on Wednesday so I can be here that night. And a lot of people offered to help me pack and unpack. And I appreciate that so much. But with the problems that I have with my mind, if I had let somebody help me, I absolutely wouldn't have been able to find anything. I mean, those of you who've been to my house, you know about the notebook that has sections, and there's like a kitchen section, and you open it and it has K1 through K30, and those are boxes, and then it tells everything that's in every box, like down to Q-tips and cotton balls. That's the only way I could find things when we moved. But I appreciate everyone who helped with cleaning and painting and so much more. We've been given money and gift cards and just so much. Doug and I have been overwhelmed with the amount of love and support that we have received from First Baptist. It has really blown us away. And I know that many of you pray for me every day, and I can feel that. And thank y'all so much for doing that. Life is hard for all of us. We all try to remember that when you get upset with somebody somewhere. Everybody's got their stuff. Everybody's dealing with their stuff. My favorite verses are Philippians 4:4-9. And I'm going to read 6 and 7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. There are verses in the Bible where it's talking about peace with God, and then there are verses that are talking about peace with other people. But this one is talking about peace that comes from God. And I liked this definition that I found. It says, a harmony and calmness of body, mind, and spirit that supersedes earthly circumstances, and it only comes from God. When Hannah was 5, she was on the trampoline with David, who was 7, and they were playing football. Makes sense, huh? And she went up high to catch it and came down on the ground on her head. And I wasn't out there. And before you judge me for not watching every move my kids made, you haven't raised kids exactly like mine. And I homeschooled them at the time. And by the time we finished our homeschool work, they needed recess, and I needed another cup of coffee. So she came in the house, and she had leaves in her hair and a big bump on her head. And David told me that she went to sleep, and so she was completely knocked out before they came in. So I put ice on her head, and I gave her some water, and I kind of felt like we were headed to the hospital, so I was grabbing some things. And the first thing that I did was grab my Bible and go to God. And I brought the actual Bible that I was using then, and it has fallen apart.
It's all right.
And so Hannah recovered it for me with pink duct tape, with little pink ribbons. So, but I got my Bible out and I went to God, and He took me to this verse. I didn't like go in the concordance and try to find a word that fit and then try to make a verse fit my situation. This is just where He took me. This is Psalm 145:14. It says, it still gives me goosebumps. The Lord sustains all who fall and raises up all who are bowed down. And in the margin it says 2598. Hannah fell off the trampoline and may have a concussion. God will take care of her.
Man.
And then I hear her throwing up, and I went in the kitchen, and she was coming down the hall holding onto the wall because she was so dizzy. And I ran over and looked at her eyes, and her pupils were about like that. Doug was out of town. He's been out of town every time something like that happens. So we jumped in his little Ford Ranger pickup, and it was 30 miles to the nearest hospital. And David was holding the bucket for Hannah to throw up in, and every time she threw up, he would gag and think that he was going to throw up. So we got her there, and they did a CAT scan and said that she had a concussion. There was no bleeding, but they admitted her because they wanted to get some fluids in her, and they wanted to watch her to make sure it didn't swell or bleed or whatever. It was a pretty big bump. Now, those of you who are in the medical field are going to have trouble with this next part because it's not how things are done. But I'm just telling you what happened to me in 1998, okay? A few hours later, a nurse came in and she said, just in case, would you like to talk to someone about donating Hannah's organs? And I was completely calm. I said no, and I went over and I pulled my big Bible out of my purse. And I opened it up and I showed her this verse. I said, this is why I don't need to talk to anybody about that. And that whole day, I would have naturally been a nervous wreck. But I was just calm. I felt like I looked like Beyonce, like with my hair blowing, as I was keeping Hannah calm and talking to doctors and nurses. And then I had 7-year-old David sitting in a chair for hours working on the books of the Bible, the catechism, and the scripture that he was memorizing. So God gave me peace that day, but there have been so many times since then that He's reminded me of that day, and He has said, take a break and come to me first. You know, there are always those times when just all of a sudden things change. You know, something happens, there's a phone call, whatever. And even before I have time to panic, I feel like He says, just take a deep breath and come talk to me about it first. So I guess the takeaway from my story is that wherever you find yourself today, go to God. If you're at a good place with Him, then go to Him with your worship and with your thanksgiving. If you realize that you don't have a personal relationship with Him, go to God. If you've done things that you're ashamed of, go to God. If you're dealing with things you can't control, anybody? Like your own illness or family illness or broken family relationships, go to God. If He's called you to do a work that seems far too big, go to God. Nothing else you try will work. If you try to control things, if you try to do good to take away feelings of shame, if you're looking for worldly ways to heal your heart or trying to find comfort anywhere else, it just won't work. Go to God.
Amen.